She was the obedient daughter, raised in silence and rules. He was her brother's best friend, a man carved from patience and shadows. One night, under neon lights, they broke every boundary with a single kiss. But love is never simple, especially when family, betrayal, and faith stand in the way. Will Grace choose duty or dare to follow the flame that God Himself may have placed in her heart? The rain had been threatening the city all afternoon without the courtesy of arriving. A gray weight pressed against the skyline as if the clouds themselves were undecided. From the taxi window, Grace Jang watched the neon breathe in slow pulses. Rose, blue, electric amber, each sign flicking like a dare. Are you still the quiet daughter, or have you learned to live louder? 5 days home from London, and already the Jang mansion had remembered how to listen. The grandfather clock announced obedience with its brass throat. Hallways repeated her footsteps back to her as if to check the arithmetic of her days. Even the roses in the garden seemed to stand straighter in her mother's presence. She had forgotten that silence could be heavy, that love could be measured out in rules. So when Lily Lynn called at dusk, voice bright with mischief and perfume, Grace said yes before she could think of a reason to say no. The driver nosed the car into an alley slick with old rain and citrus peels, and at the end of it, a sign blinked over a dark door. Solstice. Bass trembled through the pavement as if the city had a second heart hidden underground. Lily emerged from the shadows in a red dress that was equal parts art and weapon. Her earrings were starbursts, her grin already forgiven. "You look like you need the kind of trouble that kisses back," she announced, and took Grace's hand before propriety could find its shoes. Inside, Solstice revealed itself as a cathedral, raised to light and sound. The dance floor heaved gently under a haze the color of postcards from the future. A saxophone somewhere far off made a human sound, and the bar mirrored the room until people seemed to be drinking themselves. Grace let the music borrow her for a song or two. Lily spinning her, laughter catching against her collarbone, then slipped free toward the counter, breath quick with the prospect of choice. She was not a woman given to bars or bargains with midnight. Whole years of her life had been spent in polite conversation with expectations. But tonight a door had opened inside her, and a draft moved through the rooms. She asked for something sweet because sweet was harder to regret, and watched the bartender burn an orange peel to coax the perfume into the glass. She tasted fruit first, then the low blue heat beneath it, and that was when she saw him. He sat alone in a corner booth like a secret the room had decided to keep for itself. Black shirt, sleeves calmly rolled, collar open at the throat, a metal lighter nestling in his palm and ticking open and shut with the patience of someone who could wait out a storm. Stillness clung to him in a room that had forgotten the art. When he shifted and the light caught his face, she saw the small beauty mark at the outer corner of his left eye, a flaw too precise to be anything but an argument against perfection. She looked away, and then, because the night had a voice and it was speaking in her direction, she looked back. His gaze was unhurried, the opposite of Annette. It did not hunt or plead, it received. Lily followed the line of Grace's attention, whistled softly, and said something about terrible decisions being the more interesting kind, but her voice had receded, as if the floor had decided to put distance between Grace and everyone not currently required by fate. Grace set her glass down, felt the old obedience switch to a lower gear, and crossed the room. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, and was surprised by the softness in her voice, as if someone had tuned her to a key she hadn't used since childhood. "Now it is," he said. His mouth lifted a fraction, his eyes did not. Up close, he smelled faintly of cedar, a clean, cool note that suggested rain deep in tall trees. Her name lived behind her teeth, but she did not offer it. He did not offer his. They were neither strangers nor acquaintances yet. They were 2 points on a map suddenly discovering a road between them. "What are you drinking?" he asked, not to make conversation, but to place a marker in the air. "Something sweet," she said, and he gave the smallest nod, as if to say that sweetness was a risk worth taking. Time changed texture after that. She remembers only fragments now, as if memory had been taught to edit. The way the lighter's lid spoke in a small metal syllable. The way the blue of the room bled into the white of his cuff, the way her own pulse began to keep time with a song that wasn't playing. She does not remember leaving the booth, only the corridor with the emergency exit sign humming like a hive. The door clicked shut behind them and the bass lowered itself to a distant whether. He put a hand to the frame above her shoulder, the way a person braces a wall before asking it to stand another decade. He was careful with her space and near enough to reorder it. "Are you sure?" he asked. And it was not a transaction, not a dare. It was an invitation phrased like a stay against regret. Her answer bypassed language and arrived as touch. When he kissed her, she discovered that some questions can be answered only by refusing to survive them unchanged. The night unfolded in heat and light and silk, in breath that shortened and softened and lengthened again. She remembers a laugh, his or hers, she could not swear, remembers the fall of a sleeve that found her skin, remembers the way the city continued outside, as if lives were not rearranging themselves overhead. She remembers, too, a moment of stillness in the dark, where she heard nothing but two human hearts practicing the old duet and thought, with a clarity that arrived like cold water. So this is the sound of being found. Morning was gentler than it had any right to be. Curtains held the sun in their fists and let it slip through their fingers in thin gold ribbons. A chandelier threw fragments of light so clean they felt like new tools. Her head was muzzy the way happiness is when it has not yet learned to stand up. Her body felt both used and new, like a room made ready for guests. She found her dress on a chair in a condition that would require euphemism and reached instead for the black shirt draped over a carved chair back. It was too large, smelled faintly of cedar and smoke and a decision made, and it fell on her like permission. There was a business card on the bedside table with a name she did not read. She rolled it twice between her fingers, the way you might weigh a coin you do not intend to spend, and slid it into the pocket of the shirt as if postponement were a kind of courage. In the bathroom, the mirror startled her with someone vivid, mouth kissed to a deeper red than cosmetics achieve, hair less obedient than the woman who owned it. She laughed once, quietly at herself, and then the quiet broke, because laughter is a cousin to grief, and both belong to thresholds. He was in the shower. The water sang the body's ordinary benedictions. For a second, she considered staying until he came out, considered speaking her name into the air he was breathing. But the good girl in her, startled by the sudden possibility of being good differently, elected for escape. The brave girl in her would catch up later. She left a note that said nothing, "Thank you," without the humiliation of the words, and walked out with the city already in gear. On the sidewalk, the morning had its own perfume, steamed buns and diesel and the first cut of citrus from a vendor who whistled a tune whose name Grace almost remembered. Taxis lifted their yellow shoulders. The world did not announce that something unrepeatable had occurred. It merely made room for her to walk through it carrying a secret like heat under the skin. She pressed the elevator button with a finger that still remembered a stranger's mouth and smiled in spite of the danger. In the taxi, she took the card out and looked at the letters without allowing them to arrange themselves into a person. She put it back. She watched the city fold and unfold, vendors, schools, a man in a blue jacket riding a bicycle with a bouquet of umbrellas strapped to the back, and told herself she was not delaying knowledge. She was savoring wonder. At home, the mansion received her with its old, elegant disapproval, and for once, she did not mistake it for love. She crept past the grandfather clock, which tutted regardless, and stood in her room under the serious gaze of 20 years' worth of photographs. She undressed slowly, folded the shirt with a care that was not shame, and hid it not in a drawer but in plain sight on the chair by the window where the morning could find it. Then she lay down, closed her eyes, and let the night replay its essential frames. The beauty mark at the corner of his eye, the emergency exit light humming like an omen that had decided to be kind, the question that had been careful with her, the way her yes had felt less like surrender than like a door on well-oiled hinges. The last thing she thought, before sleep took her by the wrist and tugged, was not a name, but a sentence. Something has begun. The Jiang Mansion never merely hosted a party, it rehearsed its own legend. From the gates trimmed by gardeners with the precision of surgeons to the marble foyer that threw every footstep back as an echo of money, the house performed. Chandeliers breathed a rain of fractured light onto lacquered floors. The air was perfumed with lilies and old cognac, and the string quartet in the conservatory played the kind of music that made conversations sound more intelligent than they were. Staff moved in pairs with the quiet choreography of swans. It should have calmed Grace, this machine of ceremony she'd grown up inside, but something under her ribs insisted on pacing like a caged animal, a restlessness left over from Solstice, where bass had loosened the hinges of her restraint, and cedarwood had taught her that wanting could be a verb. She stood beneath the grand spiral staircase, while a stylist fussed over a curl that refused to be mathematically obedient. The navy gown skimmed her collarbones and fell like midnight. Gloves of light slid over the silk when she shifted, and the mirror at the landing returned a woman a little too poised to be entirely honest. Guests arrived in predictable constellations. Political gravities orbited her father with the smug drift of planets sure of their mass. Society's butterflies orbited her mother, sipping compliments like nectar, and men with young faces and old ambitions orbited Jason, learning the geometry of proximity. Grace smiled as required, fielded observations about London and art and how refreshing your generation is, accepted a flute of champagne because refusing would call attention to itself, and let the bubbles argue with her pulse. She had learned since childhood to move through these rooms like water through a familiar channel, to be pleasant but unremarkable, to haunt without haunting. Tonight the old instructions sat on her shoulders, and yet, even now, she kept touching the memory of a black shirt with her fingertips, as if the fabric might reappear if summoned correctly. The logic of the occasion proceeded. A chairman with eyebrows like quotation marks complained about regulation. A philanthropist bragged about the moral superiority of her newest gala. A cousin counted calories aloud like sins. The quartet slipped into Vivaldi. The chandelier hummed its small electric beehive hum. Grace was excellently behaved, but her attention had already been claimed by a magnet she could neither see nor deny. It tugged at her spine each time the staircase sighed with new arrivals. When the house collectively inhaled, as if sensing a star take its place, she knew before she turned. Jason stood near the top step, tuxedo sculpted to the myth of his shoulders, wearing the sort of smile that had always opened doors. He descended in the measured rhythm of someone sure that the room existed for his entrance. And then, just behind him, the man the room had not yet learned to deserve. Ethan Chu, black. Suit that admitted its tailor, shirt the precise white that made the light itself seem lazy, tie a clean line that promised a temperament to match. The beauty mark by his left eye caught a facet from the chandelier and sent it back as a tiny signal, visible perhaps only to her. To anyone else, he was merely handsome and composed. To Grace, he was a fault line running under polished floor. She held her glass a fraction too tight. Jason reached the bottom, spread an arm with theatrical affection. "There she is," he announced to the nearest cluster of influence, "my globetrotter." Then, turning, almost as an afterthought, but timed like good comedy, "Grace, meet Ethan, our partner in the new venture." Visionary. Scary good. The word partner landed with a peculiar double resonance in her chest. Ethan extended a hand and a professional smile, and for the benefit of the audience, they were exactly what he said. New acquaintances. For the benefit of the secret constituency, her pulse, his gaze, they were the continuation of a conversation paused without punctuation. His palm was warm, his grip measured, and in that brief pressure there was nothing anyone could censure, and everything she could feel. The undercurrent of a remembered breath, the shock of recognition disguised as courtesy, the humility of a man who knew how to behave, and the arrogance of one who would not pretend the night at Solstice hadn't happened. "Pleasure," he said, and the word went about the room shaking hands with the air, perfectly respectable. Grace's likewise arrived intact, but she felt it leave teeth marks on her tongue on the way out. Jason, wrapped with himself and surrounded by people eager to be wrapped with him, launched into a small lecture about latency and scale. Ethan listened, asked one thoughtful question that made two directors glance at him differently, and calibrated his smile to defer while refusing to diminish. He had the composure of someone who had practiced invisibility as a tactic and abandoned it as a lie. Grace drifted with the current, speaking politely to a judge who called her young lady as if issuing a verdict, to a woman who misremembered meeting her 5 times, to a man who said the word disruption as if it were a seasoning. But like a needle aligning itself to a field it cannot see, she found him again and again, across the buffet of porcelain hills, steaming with careful food, near the window where the garden spread itself like a low green sea, beside the portrait of some ancestor who had learned the same tricks of posture and myth. Each time their eyes met, it was brief, unremarkable to anyone not possessing a private stake in light, and each time it said, "I am here. Are you still the same?" The answer that rose in her throat tasted like yes. After an hour of this performance, Grace felt the limits of her mask. She excused herself with something cultured about powder and mirrors. The powder room acknowledged its own importance with marble, as pale as an obedient moon. The faucets were small sculptures, the mirror framed in gilt that stopped just short of ridicule, and the light had been arranged to flatter or forgive, depending on angle. She shut the door soft as an apology and leaned on the counter, watching the stranger in the mirror practice her face. Lipstick, crisp, a red civilized into elegance, hair, an architecture, pupils, a little large. She breathed once for the girl who had run laughing into an alley behind a club, and once for the woman who had not yet learned how to carry a secret in a mansion built to expose. When the latch clicked, she knew the scent before the sound. Cedar, the careful cool of a forest that had swallowed rain. He closed the door behind him, and the little world recalibrated its gravity. Ethan crossed the marble with unhurried steps and stopped a conversational distance away, hands easy at his sides, but his gaze stripped time of its costume. "Beautiful," he said, not as compliment but as observation, the way one remarks on weather that has decided a day. "You shouldn't be here," Grace managed, and found that her voice had acquired a tremor that could be mistaken for outrage if one were unkind. "Neither should you," he said softly, and came that fraction closer that measures the difference between safety and truth. His thumb rose, and as gently as if he were correcting a smudge of paint on a work in progress, he brushed the edge of her mouth. The red blurred into something less official. The mirror betrayed her, enlarging the moment into a scene, and she felt heat at the top of her chest the way a struck match feels its own surprise. "You didn't call," he murmured, not accusatory, not aggrieved, but with the private amusement of a man testing the structure of a bridge he intends to cross regardless. "I wondered if you had elected to belong to your mirrors." "As if I could forget," she said, and hated how near to confession the words were. He leaned in until the breath of his next sentence warmed the delicate place beneath her ear. "Tomorrow," he said, the syllables careful as cut crystal, 3 o'clock. She wanted to say no for the sake of a principle she could not name. She wanted to say yes because her body, already moving through the scene that would result, had no patience for the paperwork of refusal. "You do not command me," she said, and watched his mouth shape a smile that conceded nothing and apologized for less. "I don't," he answered. "I'm reminding you that the door you opened didn't close simply because you left the room." She pressed her palm to his chest then, the way one tests an idea for stability, and found not hardness, but steadiness, which is more dangerous. "You're reckless," she said, but what she meant was "I am." "And you," he said, stepping back as if to refrain from a victory he had not yet earned, "are afraid of how much you want to be." He left with the same economy with which he'd arrived, taking the cedar with him and leaving its ghost. The latch made a small, final sound, and Grace remained with her reflection and the smear on her lip that looked like evidence. She repaired it with the meticulousness of a surgeon suturing more than skin. When she returned to the ballroom, the quartet had taken up something brighter, and the chandeliers continued their argument with the dark. Jason stood in a circle of listeners explaining a term sheet as if he'd invented sheets and terms. Her father punctuated a minister's story with a low laugh that meant, "I hear you, and you're not dangerous." Her mother floated past with a diplomat's smile that translated 7 languages into welcome. Ethan, at a polite distance, was being pursued by an industrialist's wife who collected handsome men like paperweights. He received her questions with immaculate neutrality and made his exit look like hers. Later, when the caterers revealed a cake engineered to stand like a building, when a senator committed a small error and then a larger one, when glasses were raised to the success of ventures that did not yet exist, when the first yawns hid themselves behind linen and pearls, Grace found herself beside Jason near the garden doors, the night outside arranged in black silk. "You're quiet," Jason said, but lightly, not as accusation. "Listening," she said. "To what?" "To how rooms decide what they're made for." He laughed, charmed even by puzzles he did not intend to solve. "And tonight?" "Position," she said, and let the words sit. He looked at her as if the sister he'd filed under predictable had slapped a new label onto herself in small, neat letters. "You'll like Ethan," he said then, as if he were not already too late. "He's not the loudest man in the room, but he's the one it rearranges itself around." She kept her eyes on the garden. The roses stood like a soft army. "Is that your professional assessment?" "And personal," he said, warmth shading toward pride. "He reminds me that endurance is not a synonym for stubbornness." That surprised her enough to turn and look at him, to register for the first time that Jason's admiration contained a thread of caution. She wanted to tell her brother everything and also nothing. She wanted to ask him whether a man who moved carefully through a room would be careful with a heart. Instead, she said, "Thank you for the party." And he grimaced in gratitude. Thank Mother. She kept the guest list from becoming a zoo. When she looked back across the room, Ethan was gone from his most recent conversation, but had repositioned himself near the portrait again, in the lane of light thrown by a chandelier arm, where he could be seen or not seen depending on the appetite of the viewer. Their eyes met once more, and this time the exchange contained not only history, but instruction. "We are practicing how to exist in the same world where other people live." She felt the thread between them pull snug, not choking, not slack, and knew with a clarity that made her both giddy and ill that tomorrow at 3 o'clock was not a request, nor an order, nor a temptation. It was a continuation written in a tense the party had no grammar for. When at last the guests thinned and goodbyes performed their 1,000 small curtsies and the quartet put away its polished sadness, Grace stood at the foot of the staircase and watched the house undress. Staff collected glasses in quiet stacks. Lilies adjusted their perfume downward. The chandelier, finally alone with itself, hummed the tune. Old houses hum when they decide not to judge. She touched the new line of her mouth where his thumb had rewritten her evening and felt the kind of fear that means you are in the right city, at the right hour, wearing the wrong armor, and everything might therefore be possible. From the 40th floor, the city stretched beneath them like a jeweled serpent, coiling through the dark, streets pulsing with headlights, bridges shining like thin silver threads, and the river swallowing all light into its restless surface before releasing it back in trembling fragments. Grace Jung stood by the glass wall in Ethan Chu's apartment, her reflection hovering faintly against the skyline, and wondered how she, obedient daughter of the Jung household, had crossed into this stranger's life. She had told herself all morning that she would refuse, that she would not go, that she would keep the night at solstice folded away like a dangerous letter. But when the clock touched 3, she was already in his elevator, heart pounding as the numbers climbed toward inevitability. The apartment surprised her. It did not roar of money as the mansion did. It spoke instead of solitude chosen carefully. Leather, steel, and glass created a disciplined frame, but small traces softened it. A half-finished book on the sofa, a green plant leaning stubbornly toward the light, the faint aroma of coffee freshly made. She had expected the arrogance of empire, yet what she found was a kind of sanctuary built by one man for one life. And then he appeared, barefoot in gray joggers, hair damp from the shower, carrying 2 plates of eggs and toast as if she were not a guest but someone expected. "Eat first," he said, "explanations later." His voice had the calmness of stone under water. He slid a pair of pink slippers toward her feet, so casual she almost laughed. "You think I'll stay?" she asked. "I think you'll be more comfortable," he replied, already pouring her tea. That was his gift. He never demanded, but he never retreated, and the world bent itself around his steadiness until saying no felt like denying gravity. She ate, though her stomach was too tangled to hunger, told herself she would leave afterward, but afterward became evening, evening became morning, and soon she had learned the rhythms of this high perch above the city. He worked long hours at a desk near the window, silent but not excluding her, while she drifted through his space, tracing her fingers over spines of books, studying the painting left leaning against the wall, learning him not through declarations but through details. When he placed her teacup before her, he always turned the handle to her hand. When he cooked noodles at night, the garlic and chili filled the room, and he laughed when sauce stained his shirt. She had entered as a trespasser and found herself inhabiting a life. At Lily's gallery show, she wore a pale green dress, smiled with the composure expected of her, and endured questions about art in Europe. But she felt every breath of Ethan's presence when he arrived disguised in gold-rimmed glasses, presenting himself to patrons as nothing more dangerous than an investor. To the world, he was courteous, distant. To her, every glance was a confession, every pause a touch. When the crowd pressed close to admire a canvas, his hand brushed lightly across her back, gone in an instant, yet burning into her skin long after. At a rooftop dinner, Jason raised his glass to toast their venture, laughter booming into the city air, and Grace played the dutiful sister. But under the table, Ethan's shoe slid against her calf, deliberate, measured, intimate. Jason never noticed, Ethan never faltered in conversation, but Grace's pulse betrayed her. She lived suspended between two truths: the family she could not betray, and the man she could not release. Inevitably, the mask cracked. One evening, he drove her home, the silence heavy between them, headlights slicing through the night. At last he said, "Is this all I am to you? A secret?" His voice was steady, but the hurt beneath it was sharp as glass. She turned to him, startled. "You know why it has to be this way." "Do I?" he asked, hands tightening on the wheel. "Or is that just the story you tell yourself so you don't have to choose?" Her breath caught. "I need time." "Time," he echoed, tasting the word with bitterness. "Time doesn't change what already is." He said nothing more until the mansion gates swallowed her, but his silence filled the car like a storm waiting to break. That night, she lay awake in her childhood room, the old house breathing judgment around her. She thought of Ethan's apartment, of its view that made her feel endless, of his patience that steadied her own heart. She thought of Jason, of her father, of the invisible chains draped across her shoulders. She thought of herself, not as daughter or sister, but as a woman who had once said yes in a narrow corridor under an emergency exit light. She realized that secrets, like seasons, cannot last forever. When Ethan left on business for 2 weeks, the silence grew unbearable. She filled it with luncheons, errands, polite conversation, but each rumor of him stung. Women whispering at galas, laughter over coffee cups, speculation about who would win his attention. At night, she pressed her face into the black shirt she had hidden and breathed cedar until she slept. One evening, she could no longer endure. She drove alone up the mountain road, headlights carving into the dark, anger and longing twisting until she could hardly steer. Then in her mirror, she saw it. A black Maybach gliding closer, sleek as inevitability. It overtook her, cut sharply in front, forced her to brake hard, gravel scattering under her tires. Her door flew open, words of fury rising to her lips, but the wind carried cedarwood and certainty. Ethan stepped out, the night tugging at his shirt, his eyes burning like the city's whole skyline condensed into 2 points of fire. "What are you doing?" she cried, voice breaking. "What are you doing?" he countered, stepping toward her. "Running from me or from yourself?" "I don't know." Her scream tore from her chest. "I don't know how to choose." He stopped inches from her, breath mingling, and his voice softened into steel. "If you can ache," he said, "you can choose." The silence that followed was louder than any storm. Tears blurred her eyes as she stared at him, and she knew then that the choice was already made, had been made long ago in the hum of a club's corridor, in the brush of his thumb smearing her lipstick, in the way the world itself tilted whenever he walked into it. She had chosen, even if she had not yet spoken the word. Secrets imagine themselves clever, but most die of ordinary causes. A light left on, a door ajar, a name spoken where the walls remember. This one betrayed itself by glowing, faint and loyal, on the edge of a leather sofa where work and tenderness had been trying all month to learn each other's grammar. Jason Jiang arrived at Ethan Chu's apartment because a deal had decided to wobble, and a file, printed and annotated, had to be found before midnight turned respectable men into amateurs. The private elevator opened to a clean geometry of steel and glass, and the faint aroma of cedar that Jason had always assumed was some expensive candle. He followed habit to the study, saw the folder, and only then noticed the small, ordinary rectangle of light on the charger by the couch. It was not the light that undid him. It was the photograph radiant on the lock screen, his sister on a windy bridge in London, scarf trying to escape her throat, laughing with her whole face. Grace guarded her devices like a dragon guards its last unspent miracle. Jason felt the tectonic shudder beneath his shoes, the swift recalculation of a room he had considered mapped. Other witnesses testified without meaning to. A silk scarf slung over the back of a chair in a color Grace had worn to their mother's birthday. A teacup, whose lip still held the memory of a gloss Jason recognized because he had paid, grudgingly and affectionately, for it on a shopping trip last winter, a thin gold hairpin gleaming against the black leather like a sliver of moon. "Ethan!" he called, and the name had edges. Ethan stepped out of the study in a black shirt with the collar open, sleeves rolled, looking as competent and composed as any partner Jason had ever trusted. He saw the phone at once, which told Jason everything he needed about the intelligence of the man he was about to hit. "You want to explain," Jason said, "why my sister's world is lighting your living room." Ethan did not reach for the phone, did not reach for an excuse, did not reach, even, for dignity. He reached only for the truth that would get them both to the next hour alive. "Yes," he said, and then, because Jason deserved the whole answer even if he would hate it, "I love her." The punch was not theatrical. Jason was a man who hit like he negotiated, directly once, with the precision of someone who intends belief to travel faster than blood. It landed at the corner of Ethan's mouth, just under the beauty mark, and for an instant time did an old trick and stood still, so it could watch. Ethan staggered, and the room flickered from abstract to specific. Pain, copper, the startled animal of breath. He righted himself. He did not lift his hands. "You betrayed me," Jason said, fury widening the vowels until the words sounded older than either of them. "You walked into my house and my business and into my family and you—" Another punch, a lesser one, because disbelief had stolen some of the power from rage. Ethan absorbed it like a man who had learned early that not all blows are arguments. Some are rituals that must pass through the body so the mind can proceed. "Stop," a voice said that belonged to both their childhood and neither's command, and Grace was there, hair loose, wearing one of Ethan's shirts buttoned in a hurry so that it fell like the confession it was. She took in the scene, her brother's fist, Ethan's blood, her phone burning its honest light, and recognized the end of one world and the beginning of another. "It was me," she said, stepping between them with hands that trembled only after she had raised them. "I chose this. I went to him. If you hit anyone for the truth, you hit me." The sentence did what the punches could not. It broke something, not between brothers in ambition, but inside Jason himself, where the map labeled sister had never included woman. His face twisted with hurt that could not find an exit. "Do you know," he said to Ethan, but aiming it at guilt, "what you've invited?" "My father does not compromise on family. He does not revise, 'Then I will be patient,'" Ethan said, wiping blood from his lip with the back of his hand and tasting the metallic fact of consequence. "But I won't lie." "You already did," Jason snapped. But the fury had changed. Less fire, more ash, and he left with the folder because business, like weather, does not wait for the completion of private storms. The door shut with a temperate sound. The apartment found its breath again. Night has a way of making gardens honest. Grace fled the apartment not to escape Ethan, but to locate herself, which is another kind of loyalty. She drove home and, because rooms were too full of witness, slipped into the rose garden where the trellises formed soft gates and the shadows under leaves made a chapel of privacy. The roses were in that stubborn phase between bloom and fatigue, heads heavy, perfume bruised into something darker. She knelt without deciding to, a silk skirt folding under her like water, and began to do the child's arithmetic that has survived every empire. He loves me not. Petals fell onto her palms, red as the mouth she had learned 2 weeks ago. She was trying to count certainty. She was pretending that the math had power. Footsteps on gravel, the particular hush a man carries when he is about to change the hour. Cedar came first, then Shadow, then Ethan himself with his lips split and his eyes lit from the inside like a city on power, saved for festivals. He did not touch her at once as if the night had asked for ceremony. "If you regret," he began, and the word hurt them both. "I don't," she said, and discovered that saying it out loud rearranged the garden. He crouched beside her, their shoulders almost touching, two conspirators with the whole earth to hide from and nowhere to hide but each other. "Then we stop letting the fear speak for us," he said. He took her left hand, the one she had always used to carry her family's expectations, and slid something cool over the knuckle. The ring caught the moon and manufactured a dawn of its own, a pink diamond that managed the trick of looking both delicate and unarguable. Grace gasped, not because it was large, it wasn't, but because it made a promise out of an hour. "This isn't leverage," Ethan said, as if anticipating the worst reading and tearing it up. "It's a compass. If your father refuses me forever, I will still stand at your door. If your brother never forgives me, I will still learn how to be his ally in everything that is not you. If the city laughs, we will practice endurance until it bores of the sound. I am not promising you ease. I am promising you the practice of love." A wind moved through the roses as if the garden had exhaled. Grace pressed her fingers to the stone, felt its exact fit, and heard the quiet click of her life anchoring to a decision. "Then we fight," she said, and laughed once at the strangeness of using that verb to describe something that made her body feel like rescue. "Together," Ethan said, and the word was heavier than ring or vow because it contained the future as a series of rooms they would have to arrange and rearrange until it held. In the morning, the study smelled of ink and old wood and power exercised politely. Mr. Jiang sat behind the desk that had turned so many men into versions of themselves they had not meant to become. The window behind him framed the trees with an authority that dared anyone to argue that nature was a kind of wealth. Jason stood to the side with a bruise forming on his knuckles and another forming somewhere nobody could see. Mrs. Jiang did not enter. This was a room where fathers and sons believed in themselves too loudly. Grace hovered near the door, uninvited and unwilling to be dismissed. Ethan stepped in, wearing a suit that acknowledged tradition without genuflecting to it, and bowed, not low enough to humiliate himself, not shallow enough to insult the past. He did not apologize for loving her because he was not sorry. He apologized instead for the manner of discovery, because he respected the dignity that had been lost. "You think," Mr. Jiang said with a gated calm, "that you can arrive with your beautiful phrases and your strong chin and your patience and propose that my daughter be a project you manage." "No," Ethan said, and he let the no sit long enough to pour itself a drink. "I think she is a person I love. I am proposing that I be the man who practices loving her well." Mr. Jiang's eyes were old weapons. "Practice," he repeated softly. "The world does not forgive rehearsal." "The world forgives results," Ethan answered, and there was nothing defiant in the sentence. It was a fact he had tested. "I am offering endurance, not noise. I won't promise her safety from pain. I will promise her company in it. I won't promise her a life without work. I will promise to carry the weight fairly. I cannot offer your name a larger empire. I can offer your daughter a partner who arrives on time." Jason, who had spent years mistaking speed for reliability, almost smiled at that and then remembered he was furious. Mr. Jiang tilted his head as if trying to hear an instrument tuning beneath the obvious music. "You have no family to speak for you," he said, not cruelly, but as if noting a lack in a ledger. "I speak for myself," Ethan said, "and for the man my parents raised until I had to raise myself. I have references, not roots. If you require the former, I will bring them. If you require the latter, I cannot grow them on demand." The old man tapped the desk once, a sound like a small gavel finally glad to be wood. "You will be tempted, when business works, to place ambition above my daughter. And when business breaks, to place pride above my daughter. Every man who has sat where you sit thinks he is the exception. Are you?" Ethan considered the only honest answer. "No, I am a man. I will be tempted. So I have already engineered systems that make disloyalty difficult. People whose paychecks allow them to tell me I'm wrong. Calendars that give dinner the same weight as quarterly earnings. A door key she can use when I am weakest, so that weakness does not decorate itself with solitude. If I fail, I will fail in front of her, and repair in front of her." Silence pooled in the corners of the room, the way dusk does in rooms that have not learned to admit evening graciously. Grace watched her father, listening not for eloquence but for seams. She watched Jason learn to watch. She watched Ethan's hands remain still, because he knew that scale and tone are part of content. "I will not bless this," Mr. Jiang said at last, and Grace's heart fell and kept falling until the next sentence caught it. "I will not forbid it. You will come to dinner. You will be examined not as a suitor, but as a fact. If you are a fact, you will endure the meal." It was as close to mercy as the old man's pride could sculpt. That night in the rose garden they rehearsed how to breathe while waiting. The ring found the moon again. Grace lifted her hand and saw in the stone not a jewel, but a small clock set to a truthful hour. "He didn't say yes," she whispered, as if the roses might be tempted to translate. "No," Ethan said, and something like a smile passed through his voice. "But he said a kind no, which means it's a yes with homework." She leaned into him then, tired down to the names of her bones, and asked, not as a test but as a census of their resources, "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" "Every day," he said, "because the only way to keep a promise is to keep a truth with it, but never of what I'm fighting for." Somewhere in the house, a clock counted out the remaining distance to dinner. Somewhere in the city, a boardroom congratulated itself without knowing it was irrelevant to the only negotiation that mattered. Grace closed her eyes and felt the practice begin. The work of keeping soft what the world would harden, the work of showing up. In the distance, thunder crawled across the ridge and made no decision at all. The roses held their breath and then, wisely, began to open. The mansion had been dressed for ceremony many times before. Political dinners, charity galas, Jason's birthdays heavy with expectation. But tonight felt different, as though the air itself had agreed to witness. Afternoon light bled through tall windows, soft and gold, laying stripes across the polished floor like invitations. The long mahogany table wore its best porcelain, steam rising from braised sea bass and gingered greens, the fragrance of lilies braiding itself into the aroma of broth. The house was ready for civility, though civility tonight would mean more than polished manners. It would mean deciding whether love could exist in plain sight. Grace arrived early, wearing a dress the color of dusk, palms pressed briefly against the linen as if to steady herself. Jason appeared next, his suit impeccable, his expression cautious, his silence less like a weapon and more like a tool he might be learning to use differently. Their father entered the dining room with the authority of a man long accustomed to gravity, bending in his direction. "We will be civil," he said, as though announcing the weather. Their mother adjusted a vase of lilies and replied gently, "Civility begins with tea." When Ethan arrived, he did not look like a conqueror. He entered quietly in a black suit, tie exact, his composure balanced between confidence and humility. He greeted her parents with formal care, Jason with a nod that admitted history without apologizing for it, and Grace only with the briefest glance, a harbor glimpse, grateful and sure. He poured tea first for her father, turned the handle of her mother's cup precisely toward her, and sat as if he understood that patience itself was part of the meal. Dinner began like a ceremony that had swallowed a storm. Mr. Jiang asked about markets. Ethan answered without theater, explaining supply chains and risks as if honesty were more persuasive than polish. Mrs. Jiang inquired about his parents. He admitted their graves were far, but he visited when he could, then lightened the weight with a story of a neighbor's old dog who insisted on escorting him to the cemetery gate. Even Jason almost smiled. Chopsticks clicked politely, bowls were refilled. Under the table, Grace's hand found Ethan's, and though his jaw tightened, he kept speaking evenly, trusting that intimacy need not announce itself to be true. The storm broke only briefly when Jason's phone vibrated and he stepped onto the terrace. In the past, such a departure might have collapsed the evening, but Mrs. Jiang leaned forward and asked Ethan if he cooked. He admitted a talent for burning toast when distracted, and her father, unexpectedly, asked him for the recipe of a chicken dish Ethan had once sent over. "Give it to your chef," Mr. Jiang said dryly. "He oversalts." It was not approval, but it was teasing, and Ethan received it like a gift, promising to write it down. When Jason returned, the Bond desk still buzzing in his white ear, he and Ethan exchanged the professional grimace of men drafted into the same army by necessity. For a heartbeat, they were not rivals but allies, and Grace, watching, saw that something fragile and necessary had shifted. Dessert arrived. White fungus soup with lotus seeds, faintly sweet, faintly medicinal, like families themselves. Mr. Jiang tasted it, set his spoon down, and looked at Ethan for a long time. "You will not make her small," he said. "No," Ethan answered steady. "I will help her become large." Grace's breath caught, and for a moment she saw her father differently, not only as judge but as man who once, long ago, had wanted the same for her mother. Mr. Jiang nodded once. It was not blessing, not yet, but it was permission to hope. After dinner, the terrace became a stage for quieter negotiations. Jason lit a cigarette and didn't smoke it, just watched the smoke sketch gray into the night. "If you hurt her," he said to Ethan, "I won't negotiate." Ethan replied, "If I hurt her, I'll call you first." Jason flicked ash into the dark and muttered, "She used to break my Lego castles." It was, in the strange dialect of brothers, a handshake. Mrs. Jiang draped her shawl over Grace's shoulders, though the night was mild, then asked Ethan about peonies, as if gardening could be the start of trust. Mr. Jiang spoke to him of suppliers and lead times, his tone less interrogation than curiosity. And Grace, standing between them all, realized that the fight was not won, but the walls had learned to bend. Later, in the quiet foyer, Ethan touched his forehead briefly to hers. "Come tomorrow," she whispered. "Mother wants to move the lilies." "Nothing special," he echoed softly. "That's my favorite." He left into the night, and she watched him go with the calm certainty of someone who had chosen and would choose again. Upstairs, she placed the ring on her nightstand for a moment. Let the moon make a temple of it. It no longer felt like rebellion or even proof. It felt like a compass. She texted Lily a photo of the empty dining room, napkins folded, chairs pushed in, chandelier quiet, and wrote, "We didn't explode. We almost laughed." Lily replied with 3 celebratory emojis and one shaped like a disco ball. Grace smiled, lay back, and thought not of victory but of practice, setting the table, pouring the tea, showing up even when tired. Love, she realized, would not arrive as fireworks. It would arrive as daily work, as patience, as 2 people choosing again and again. And in the mansion, for the first time in years, silence did not sound like judgment. It sounded like a house learning how to breathe. Love in this story was never a miracle that appeared overnight. It was born through patience, forgiveness, and the courage to choose each other every single day. True miracles don't always fall from the sky. They grow when we dare to step through fear and say yes to our hearts. And sometimes God uses love itself as a reminder that He is still here, quietly guiding, arranging, and gifting us the chance to find one another in the middle of life's noise and trials. In our daily lives, we may not sit at grand dining tables or wear dazzling rings, but every family meal, every silent hand we hold, every act of forgiveness after pain, these are the small miracles God sends us. His blessings are hidden in the laughter of children, in a father's patience, in a mother's care, and in the simple gift of waking up to love and be loved again. May God bless every heart watching this story. May He place peace in your soul, courage in your choices, and hope in your tomorrows. If you believe love can change lives, share this story with someone you care about. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to our channel to keep journeying with us, and let's pray together that God's grace and miracles reach every home and every heart in need.